This is a series of lectures, as you know, that are devoted to the questions related to human values. And let me say by way of introduction simply a word about the Tanner Foundation and the origin of the Tanner Lectures, because these are among the most well-supported lectures that we have at the university and among the most well-supported lectures of any lecture series, I think, on university campuses anywhere. The Tanner Lecture Series on Human Values are sponsored by the Tanner Foundation, which is located in Salt Lake City, Utah. The Tanner Foundation and these lecture series were created by Obert Tanner, who grew up as an impoverished child of a Mormon family whose mother had been deserted by his father when he was still a very young child. He was reared in a fairly austere situation of hardship. He ultimately made his way to Stanford, where he served briefly as a young faculty member before returning to Utah, where he then joined the faculty of the University of Utah. Concerned about ethics in the business world, an issue that still concerns us today, he also founded the O.J. Tanner Company, which originally specialized in products for employee recognition, various kinds of medals and medallions. Indeed, the Obert Tanner Company made the medals and designed the medals for the Winter Olympics of this past winter. The Tanner Company, which flourished under his leadership, also continues to flourish today, has been, as a consequence, something of a model in corporate social responsibility. And his business success formed the basis of the fortune that formed the Tanner Foundation and that now then sponsors the Tanner Lectures. These lectures are offered each year at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Michigan, Berkeley, Stanford, and not surprisingly, Utah. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this edition of the Tanner Lecture Series. And we're very, very pleased to welcome Derek Parfit with us today, considered to be one of the brightest lights in philosophical thought. He's been called by some the most important moral philosopher of the last 100 years, and by any definition is a scholar of major import. So I will now invite one of the members of the Tanner Committee, Sam Scheffler, to come and introduce our panel for today. Sam.
Ellen, do you think some people could use those chairs? I know there are a lot of people who don't have seats. Okay. It's a privilege to introduce Derek Parfit as the Berkeley Tanner Lecturer for 2002-2003. Mr. Parfit will deliver 3 lectures, one today, one tomorrow, and one Wednesday, all at 4:10 in this room. Each lecture will be followed by a brief response from one of our 3 distinguished commentators, Professor Alan Wood of Stanford University, Professor Susan Wolf of the University of North Carolina, and Professor Thomas Scanlon of Harvard. Then on Thursday at 4:10, there'll be a seminar also in this room at which all 3 commentators will make additional remarks, and there will be an opportunity for extended discussion among the panelists. I should say that although the program says that there will be a break after Derek Parfit's talk and before Alan Wood's comment, there won't be. People who need to leave should feel free to slip out quietly, but we won't be taking a break between the lecture and the comments. Derek Parfit was educated at Eton and at Oxford, and since 1967 he has been a fellow of that remarkable institution, All Souls College, Oxford, where he is now a senior research fellow. Although All Souls has been his institutional base throughout his academic career, He travels frequently to the United States, and he has held visiting appointments at several American universities. For many years, he was a regular visitor at Harvard, and he has recently been named a Global Distinguished Professor at NYU, where he will be spending part of each academic year from now on. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He edits the Oxford Ethics series for the Oxford University Press, and he sits on the editorial boards of Philosophy and Public Affairs and Economics and Philosophy. Reading Parfit, a volume of essays about his work, was published by Blackwell in 1997, and a major conference devoted to his ideas will take place at Rutgers this spring. Parfit's generosity in supporting younger philosophers and in commenting on the work in progress of his philosophical colleagues is legendary. Outside of philosophy, he is also a gifted architectural photographer who has specialized in photographs of Venice and St. Petersburg. Parfit has made pioneering contributions in the areas of moral philosophy, metaphysics, and the philosophy of mind. He first gained the attention of the philosophical community in the 1970s and early 1980s with a series of arresting and ingenious articles on personal identity and its implications for ethics, on prudence and rationality, and on our obligations to future generations, a topic that scarcely existed as a philosophical subject before Parfit turned his attention to it. Then in 1984, he published Reasons and Persons, a 543-page masterpiece that built on his earlier articles but also went far beyond them. Brilliant, iconoclastic, densely argued, and utterly original, Reasons and Persons drew rave reviews not only in the professional journals but also in the pages of the New York Review of Books and the TLS, and it became an instant classic of contemporary philosophy. The book subjects some of our most cherished beliefs about ourselves and about how we ought to live to a form of critical scrutiny that is almost painfully intense. At the most abstract level, the book's fundamental aim is to convince us that there is less involved in being a particular person than we naturally suppose, and that partly for this reason, we ought to become less concerned with ourselves and more receptive than most of us now are to a broadly utilitarian outlook that emphasizes the well-being of humanity as a whole. To overcome our resistance to these conclusions, Parfit produces a relentless onslaught of argument that is meant to convince us that we simply have no alternative but to accept them. The book has an effect on some readers that is little short of transformative. For example, one reader review posted on the Amazon.com website describes Reasons and Persons as, quote, the philosophical equivalent of a neutron bomb. And another, posted by someone from London calling himself Roasted Aubergine, describes the book in a similar vein as explosive, adding, I don't want to make it sound like some drippy self-help book, it certainly isn't, but it had a profound and life-changing effect on me and my notions of justice, punishment, and my own identity. If in the end, not everyone has been as convinced as Roasted Aubergine by all of the book's conclusions, its extraordinary influence can be seen not only in the enormous secondary literature it has generated, but also in the fact that no philosopher today could seriously consider writing on the topics it addresses without taking its arguments into account. In recent years, Parfit has published a long essay titled Equality or Priority, a characteristically ingenious and original work which was first presented as a Lindley Lecture at the University of Kansas and which has had a profound impact on debates about equality within contemporary political philosophy. He has also been working simultaneously on 3 new books, Rediscovering Reasons, On What Matters, and The Metaphysics of the Self. In these Tanner lectures, Derek Parfit turns his attention to the moral and political philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In the years since Reasons and Persons was published, there has been a great revival of Kantian moral philosophy, and utilitarianism, to which Parfit has always been sympathetic, has fallen out of favor among many philosophers, although its influence among economists and policymakers seems to be unabated. In these lectures, Parfit subjects Kantian and neo-Kantian views to characteristically searching scrutiny, and as you'll see, he arrives at some surprising conclusions. I've always thought it ironic that Derek Parfit's work, which tries to convince us to accept an attenuated conception of the self, should bear the stamp of such a powerful personality and distinctive cast of mind. With his spare prose, staccato chains of argument, and apparently inexhaustible dialectical energy, Parfit speaks in a philosophical voice that is as memorable and as memorably personal as that of any contemporary philosopher. but it is time to let you discover that for yourselves. It's my great pleasure to introduce Derek Parfit, whose first Tanner lecture is entitled Kant's Formula of Ends in Themselves.
According to Kant's best-loved statement of his supreme moral law, we must treat all rational beings and the rationality of these beings never merely as a means, but always as ends in themselves. I call this Kant's formula of ends in themselves. Using people, it's often said, is wrong. But that claim needs to be explained. If we are climbing together, I might use you as a ladder by standing on your shoulders. Or I might use you as a dictionary by asking you how some word is spelt. Such ways of using people aren't wrong. What is wrong, Kant's formula claims, is merely using people. As people say, you were just using me. How can we use people without merely using them? Well, compare first how two scientists might treat their laboratory animals. One scientist experiments in the ways that will best produce the data that she wants, regardless of the pain she causes her animals. That scientist treats her animals merely as a means. Another scientist experiments only in ways that don't cause her animals any pain, though she knows these methods to be less effective. Now, this scientist, like the first, treats her animals as a means, but she doesn't treat them merely as a means, since her way of using them is restricted by a concern for their well-being. Similar claims apply to our treatment of each other. We treat people as a means when we make any use of their abilities, activities, or other features. We don't treat people merely as a means if there are important ways in which we wouldn't harm these people, or, in Kant's phrase, act against them, because we believe that such treatment would be wrong. If our treatment of someone is relevantly and significantly governed by some such moral belief, that's enough to make it true that we don't treat this person merely as a means. Now, that definition doesn't require that our moral beliefs or acts be justified. When my mother was traveling on a Chinese river in the 1930s, her boat was held up by bandits whose moral principles permitted them to take only half of anyone's property. These bandits let my mother choose whether they would take her engagement ring or her wedding ring. Now, even if these people acted wrongly, they did not treat my mother merely as a means. Whether we're treating someone merely as a means depends on our underlying policies and attitudes, and that's in part a matter of what we would have done if the facts had been different. If my first scientist did some experiments that caused her animals no pain, she would still be treating her animals merely as a means, since it would still be true that if it were even slightly more convenient, she would inflict any amount of pain on them. Similarly, when we're treating people well, we may be treating them merely as a means. Thus, we might treat someone well with the sole aim of discovering her weaknesses or inheriting her wealth. According to Kant's formula of ends in themselves, we must never treat any rational being merely as a means. On a similar but wider view, we must never treat any conscious being merely as a means. Now, taken as claims about our attitudes, we ought to accept both those views. It's wrong to regard any rational or conscious being as a mere tool, which we are free to use in whatever way would best achieve our aims. But when Kant claims that we must never treat rational beings merely as a means, he seems to mean that in acting in this way, we would be acting wrongly. And that may not be true. Consider some gangster who, unlike my principled bandits, regards most other people merely as a means and who would injure them whenever that would benefit him. When this man buys a cup of coffee, he treats the coffee seller just as he would treat a vending machine. He'd steal from the coffee seller if that was worth the trouble, just as he'd smash the machine. But though this man treats the coffee seller merely as a means, what is wrong is only his attitude to this person. When he pays for his coffee, he doesn't act wrongly. Or consider Kant's remark, he who has it in mind to make a lying promise wants to make use of another human being merely as a means. We could similarly say, he who has it in mind to keep some promise for self-interested reasons wants to make use of another human being merely as a means. Though such a person has the wrong attitude to others, he doesn't, in keeping his promise, act wrongly. To avoid condemning such acts, we can revise Kant's claim. According to what I shall call the mere means principle, it's wrong to harm people or act against them in any way that treats them merely as a means. Since my gangster doesn't harm the coffee seller, this principle doesn't condemn his act. Now, Kant would have accepted this principle, though it expresses only part of his view. According to the other half of Kant's formula, we must treat all rational beings as ends in themselves. Now, in explaining that claim, Kant writes, rational beings are always to be valued at the same time as ends, that is, only as beings who must be able to contain in themselves the end of the very same action. Somewhat more clearly, when discussing lying promises, Kant writes, he whom I want to use for my own purposes by such a promise cannot possibly consent to my way of behaving towards him, and so himself contain the end of the action, share my purpose. Well, in these and other passages, Kant, it seems to me, asserts what I shall call the rational consent principle. It's wrong to treat people in any way to which they could not rationally consent, because they could not rationally share the aim with which we act. Now, in some cases, we let people choose whether we shall treat them in some way. Such people can give or refuse consent in what we can call the act-affecting sense. In other cases, we treat people in some way whether or not they consent. Now, these people can still give or refuse consent, but only in the declarative sense. Kant's principle should be taken to use consent in the act-affecting sense. On this principle, we ought to treat people only in ways in which, if we gave them the choice, they could rationally choose to be treated. Now, we don't treat someone merely as a means, I've claimed, if our treatment of this person is relevantly governed by a significant moral constraint. The rational consent principle is one such constraint. We don't treat people merely as a means if we would never treat them in any way to which they could not rationally consent. And that, I think, is part of what Kant means by treating people as ends in themselves. Should we accept these Kantian principles? Well, consider first these examples. Lifeboat. A single person, white, is stranded on one rock, and 5 people are stranded on another. Before the rising tide covers both rocks, we could use a lifeboat to save either white or the 5. Tunnel. A runaway train is headed for a tunnel in which it would kill 5 people. As bystanders, we could save these people's lives by switching the points, thereby redirecting the train into another tunnel. Unfortunately, white is in that other tunnel. Bridge. The train is headed for the 5, but there's no other tunnel. White is on a bridge above the track. Our only way to save the 5 would be to open by remote control the trapdoor on which white is standing, so that she would fall in front of the train, thereby triggering its automatic brake. Now, in all 3 cases, if we save the 5, white would die. But white's death would be differently related to our saving of the 5. In lifeboat, we would fail to save white so that in the time available we could save the 5. In tunnel, we'd save the 5 in a way whose foreseen side effect is that we kill white. In bridge, we would kill white as a means of saving the 5. Of those who've considered these cases, almost everyone believes that in lifeboat we either may or should save the 5. If our duty not to kill outweighs our duty to save lives, as most of us assume, it may seem that in tunnel it would be wrong for us to save the 5. Most people believe, however, that our duty not to kill does not here have such priority, since it would not be wrong to redirect the train so that it kills White rather than the 5. Most of these people also believe that though it would not be wrong to kill White as a side effect of redirecting the train, it would be wrong in Bridge to kill White as a means of stopping the train. Some other people reject that distinction, believing that in all 3 cases we ought to save as many lives as possible. Now, my aim here isn't to resolve these disagreements, but to ask what's implied by the consent and mere means principles. Suppose that in deciding how to act in Bridge, we apply these principles. We could argue, on the rational consent principle, we ought to treat people only in ways to which they could rationally consent. White could rationally consent to our killing her as a means of saving 5 other people's lives. Therefore, even if White would not in fact consent, the consent principle permits this act. We do not treat people merely as a means if our treatment of them is governed by the consent principle. Therefore, the mere means principle permits this act. Now, that argument, I believe, is sound. It may be wrong to kill one person without her consent as a means of saving several others, but that is not implied by these Kantian principles. Now, of those who are not convinced by that argument, some would reject its second premise, denying that White could rationally consent to being killed as a means. And some would reject its third premise, giving a different account of what it is to treat people merely as a means. In defending this argument's premises, I shall first discuss a rival principle. Honora O'Neill writes, if treating others as persons requires only hypothetical rational consent, we may find ourselves overriding the actual dissent of others, coercing them in the name of higher and more rational selves. It seems implausible that treating others as persons should even sometimes be a matter of overriding what others as we know them actually choose. O'Neill here suggests what we can call the veto principle. It's wrong to treat people in any way to which they do not in fact consent, or, if given the opportunity, would not consent. On this view, it isn't enough to treat people only in ways to which, if given the opportunity, they could rationally consent. Christine Korsgaard similarly claims that on Kant's view, we must never deny people the opportunity to choose how we treat them by giving or withholding their consent. In her words, an action is contrary to perfect duty, always wrong, if it's not possible for the other to assent to it. People cannot assent to a way of acting when they're given no chance to do so. Knowledge of what is going on and some power over the proceedings are the conditions of possible assent. She means they have to be able to consent in the act-affecting sense, so that we won't do it if they refuse consent. Now, on that reading, which I would question, Kant accepts the veto principle. This principle is much too strong. In many cases, there's no possible act to which all of the affected people do consent or would consent. But we shouldn't conclude that, as the veto principle implies, every possible act would in those cases be wrong. In Lifeboat, for example, even if White refuses her consent, it wouldn't be wrong for us to save the 5. Suppose next that in Earthquake, you and Black are trapped in tangled wreckage. We are rescuers who could save either Black's life or your leg. Even if you refuse consent, we ought to save Black's life rather than your leg. If we claim that people have a moral veto over how we treat them, this veto must be restricted to certain kinds of act. we might claim that whenever our acts would affect only one person, we ought to give this person a veto. And when our acts would affect more than one person, these people might have certain rights that it would be wrong to infringe without their consent. But many other ways of treating people are permissible or morally required, even if these people do or would refuse consent. For example, if you stole my wallet and you were as rich as me, I could rightly, without your consent, take my wallet back. We may think that among people's veto-supporting rights, one would be a right not to be killed. But as Tunnell seems to show, that's not so. It wouldn't be wrong for us to redirect the train without White's consent, so that it killed White rather than the 5. On the view that most of us accept, White could not veto being killed as a side effect of such a way of saving the 5. Or suppose that in a less controversial version of the case, we are the drivers of the train so that we cannot avoid killing either White or the 5. White could not rightfully insist that we kill the 5. Return now to the rational consent principle. To apply this principle, we must have beliefs about rationality and reasons. But one such view we should ignore or set aside. On this view, if it would be morally right to treat someone in some way, that's enough to make it true that this person could rationally consent to this act. If the consent principle allowed us to appeal to that view, it would be trivial. Whenever we believed that certain acts were right, we could claim that, for this reason, everyone could rationally consent to these acts. This principle should claim that for our acts to be right, we must treat people only in ways to which they could rationally consent on non-moral grounds, or for reasons that don't include the fact that these acts are right. And with that restriction added, the consent principle isn't trivial. There are many acts to which, on non-moral grounds, people could not rationally consent or rationally choose to be treated. On one widely accepted view, people couldn't rationally consent to acts that would be bad for themselves. On another common view, people couldn't rationally consent to acts that would prevent them from achieving their aims or fulfilling their desires. If we accept either of those views, we must reject the consent principle, since this principle would often lead us to unacceptable conclusions. Suppose that in earthquake, if we save Black's life rather than your leg, that would be worse for you and would frustrate some of your aims. On the views just mentioned, you could not then rationally consent to our saving Black's life, so the consent principle would mistakenly condemn this act. Suppose next that in Lifeboat it would be worse for White and would frustrate her aims if we saved the 5 rather than White. On these views, the consent principle would then again mistakenly imply that it would be wrong for us to save the 5, since White couldn't rationally consent. And there are countless other cases. It's often right to treat people in ways to which, according to these views, these people couldn't rationally consent because these acts would be bad for them or would prevent them from achieving their aims or fulfilling their desires. On the view that I believe we should accept, our reasons for acting are provided not by our aims or desires, but by the facts that give us reasons for having certain aims or desires. These are facts about what is relevantly worth achieving or doing. And though we have strong reasons to care about our own well-being, we can have reasons to care as much about some other things, such as the well-being of others. We often have sufficient reasons to do either what would be best from our own point of view or what would be best from an impartial point of view. In such cases, we could rationally act in either way. Now, on this view, which I shall describe more fully later, the consent principle is much more acceptable. I believe that in earthquake, for example, if the choice were yours, you would have sufficient reason to save either your own leg or Black's life. Since you could rationally act in either way, you could rationally consent to our saving Black's life rather than your leg. Black, in contrast, could not rationally save your leg rather than her own life, nor could she rationally consent to our doing that. Black would not have sufficient reason to make so great a sacrifice. On these assumptions, the consent principle rightly implies that we ought to save Black's life rather than your leg. In lifeboats, similar claims apply. I believe that if the choice were White's, she could rationally save her own life, but she could also rationally give up her life to save the 5. And since White could rationally consent to our saving the 5 rather than her, the consent principle rightly permits this act. Return next to tunnel. Most of us would believe that in this case it would not be wrong for us to redirect the train so that it would kill White rather than the 5. For the consent principle to permit that, it must be true that White could rationally consent to being treated in this way. And that, I believe, is true. From White's point of view, there's no relevant difference between lifeboat and tunnel. White could rationally save the 5 rather than herself, and it makes no difference whether she would save the 5 by redirecting the train so that it kills her instead. That way of dying would be no worse for White. And since White could rationally redirect the train, she could rationally consent to our doing that. Similar claims, I believe, apply to bridge. White could rationally jump in front of the train so that it would kill her rather than the 5. Bridge isn't relevantly different from tunnel. In both cases, White could rationally kill herself with an act that would save the 5, and she would have no reason to prefer to kill herself as a side effect of saving the 5 rather than as a means. Since White could rationally kill herself as a means of saving the 5, she could rationally consent to our doing that. So the consent principle also permits this act. And since White could rationally consent to this act, this principle permits it even if White would not in fact consent. Now, the consent principle here fails to support a widely held view. I mean, this is the first case of the ones I've discussed where we may think it's going wrong. Many people would believe that in killing White as a means, without her consent, we'd be acting wrongly. Now, that may be justified. But to defend this view, we cannot appeal to the consent principle. Perhaps I should say to defend it, we don't have to reject the consent principle. The consent principle just doesn't condemn that act. We may condemn it on other grounds. Now, it may be objected that even if White could rationally consent to our killing her as a means, she couldn't rationally consent to our treating her in this way without her consent. And that's what matters. A rapist might claim that his victim could rationally have consented to his sexual treatment of her. That, even if true, wouldn't justify his rape. Well, as that objection rightly assumes, the consent principle must be applied to how we actually treat people in the world as it is. Suppose that we are treating people in some way to which at the time they refuse consent. Our act is wrong according to this principle unless these people could rationally consent to being treated in this way without their consent. Now, it may seem that, as this objection claims, no one could rationally consent to being treated in some way without their consent. And if that were true, the consent principle would collapse back into or coincide with the veto principle. This principle would imply that we should never treat people in ways to which they do not in fact consent, or, given the opportunity, would not consent. But this claim is not, however, true. In a fuller statement, the consent principle can be, it's wrong to treat people in any way to which they could not have rationally given in advance their informed, unforced consent. Now, that principle rightly condemns almost all cases of rape. It's seldom true that someone could rationally consent in advance to sexual acts to which at the time she will not consent. That's seldom true because the nature of most sexual acts is greatly affected by whether at the time both parties consent. In many other cases, though, no such claims apply. Suppose that in earthquake we ask you for your consent to our saving Black's life rather than your leg. You could rationally give that consent, and you could give it in an unconditional, binding way. You could say, go ahead and save Black's life, even if I later change my mind. You could give such unconditional consent because if you later changed your mind and wished to withdraw your consent, that wouldn't make it worse for you to lose your leg. Losing a leg is in this respect unlike being raped. Since you could rationally give such unconditional consent to our saving Black's life rather than your leg, the consent principle rightly permits this act, whether or not you actually consent. Now, as before, I'm not claiming that you'd be rationally required to give such unconditional consent. You could also rationally refuse consent or rationally give consent only on condition that you didn't later change your mind. My claim is only that you could rationally choose unconditionally that we save Black's life rather than your leg. You would have sufficient reason to make that choice. Return next to Lifeboat. White, I believe, could rationally give unconditional consent to our saving the 5 rather than her. I mean, might be a situation where that mattered. If we started to save the 5 and then White withdrew her consent, we'd be unable to save some other people or whatever. White would know that if she later changed her mind and wanted to withdraw her consent, that wouldn't make it relevantly worse for her to die. So she could rationally give unconditional consent, and the consent principle then rightly permits us to save the 5, whether or not White actually consents. Similar claims apply to both tunnel and bridge. In both cases, White could give unconditional consent to our saving the 5 at the cost of her life, and the consent principle thus again permits us to save the 5, whether or not White actually consents. Return next to the mere means principle, which condemns harming people in any way that treats them merely as a means. I claim that A, we don't treat someone merely as a means if our treatment of this person is relevantly governed by a significant moral constraint. One such constraint is the consent principle. So if we're following that principle, the mere means principle would not condemn our act. In killing White without her consent as a means of saving the 5, we wouldn't be treating White merely as a means. Now, those claims, it may seem, must be mistaken. Many people have believed that to explain the wrongness of injuring one person as a means of benefiting others, we can appeal to the mere means principle. So it may seem that in my claims about this principle, I must be misunderstanding what is involved in treating people merely as a means. Robert Nozick writes, side constraints upon action reflect the underlying Kantian principle that individuals are ends and not merely means. They may not be sacrificed or used for the achieving of other ends without their consent. Nozick here suggests that B, if we seriously harm someone without her consent as a means of achieving some aim, that's enough to make it true that we're treating this person merely as a means. Well, we ought, I believe, to reject B. Consider first some judge who sentences some criminal to a year in prison. This judge's act, we can suppose, seriously harms this criminal without his consent, partly as a means of deterring future crimes. But this judge punishes this criminal only because she believes that he was rightly convicted and deserves his punishment. It would be clearly false to claim that the judge treats the criminal merely as a means. And that's false, as my account implies, because the judge's decision is governed by her belief about what this criminal deserves. Well, it might next be suggested that for someone's act to be relevantly governed by some moral constraint, this constraint must affect what this person does. That would be true of this judge if she sentenced this criminal to only 1 year in prison, though a longer sentence would better achieve the aim of deterrence, because she believed that a longer sentence would be more than this criminal deserves. If we killed White to save the 5, no such claim would be true. We would have acted in that way even if we'd regarded White as a mere means. If we harm someone as a means, and we would have acted in the very same way, whether or not we regarded the person as a mere means, that may seem to justify the charge that we're treating the person merely as a means. So on this proposal, C, we treat someone merely as a means if we harm this person without their consent as a means of achieving some aim, and we don't limit the harm that we impose in a way that makes our act less effective in achieving our aim. Well, that account is also, I believe, mistaken. For us to be able to deny that we're treating someone merely as a means, it must indeed be true that we would limit the harm that we imposed on this person, even if that would cause our aims to be worse achieved. But though it must be true that we would act in this way, that's enough. If we don't act in this way because no such act is possible, that doesn't imply that we're treating the person merely as a means. That can be shown by varying my examples. As this last claim allows, my judge doesn't treat the criminal merely as a means if she limits the punishment that she imposes, though a longer sentence would be a more effective deterrent. But suppose that though this judge would have limited this criminal's punishment in this way, she has no legal power to impose a longer sentence. Well, that wouldn't make it true that she treats the criminal merely as a means. Suppose next that in a variant of bridge, I first use remote control to cause White to fall onto the track. I do that to be sure that the 5 will be saved. I then jump onto the track closer to the train, hoping that my body will be enough to trigger the automatic brake. Now, it's clear that in this version of the case, I'm not using White merely as a means. I kill myself for White's sake. Suppose next that before I can jump onto the track, that becomes impossible. Well, that would not imply that I'm treating White merely as a means. Nor would it make a difference if, though I would have sacrificed my life to avoid killing White, that was never possible. It may help to turn to an act that most of us would believe to be right. Suppose that some nuclear power station is about to explode in a way that would kill 1 million people. This explosion cannot be prevented unless I kill someone who, because she's underground, would survive this explosion. Now, if I would have killed myself rather than this other person to prevent the explosion, I would not, in killing her, be treating her merely as a means. To treat people as ends in themselves, in Kant's sense, we must do more than follow the consent principle. Alan Wood writes that what Kant's formula fundamentally demands of our actions is that they express proper respect or reverence for the worth of humanity. It's impossible, Wood claims, to overestimate this idea's importance in Kant's work. Of the 16 duties discussed in Kant's Doctrine of Virtue, Kant defends 11 with appeals to the dignity or worth of rational nature, which is what he means by humanity, or rational beings. Well, these remarks suggest the formula of respect. It's wrong to treat people in ways that do not express respect for their dignity or worth as rational beings. Taken in its ordinary sense, this formula mistakenly condemns many permissible acts. When my gangster pays for his coffee, he's not expressing his respect for the coffee seller's dignity as a rational being. He doesn't respect the coffee seller any more than he respects the vending machine, but he's not acting wrongly. Wood interprets this formula, at least at one point, in a less ordinary sense. He writes, "We will be misled here if we think of valuing or respecting humanity as some subjective state of mind. In dealing honestly with you, I treat you with respect, whatever my inner state may be." Well, that reading seems to me too narrow. Kant's greatness consists in part in the intensity of his belief that we must regard everyone not as a mere thing or tool, but with unconditional respect. Rather than taking Kant's formula to make no claims about our attitudes, it seems better to state the formula in a way that covers both attitudes and acts. According to what we can call the respect principle, it's wrong to regard anyone with no respect for this person's dignity or worth as a rational being, and wrong to treat anyone in ways that are incompatible with such respect. When my gangster pays for his coffee, his act is compatible with respect for the coffee seller's dignity, so that this principle doesn't condemn his act, but it rightly condemns his attitude to the coffee seller. Is this a helpful principle when applied to acts? Wood states this principle as FH, formula of humanity. Always respect humanity in one's own person as well as that of another as an end in itself. It may be objected, Wood writes, that this principle is so empty and vague and its meaning so flexible and disputable that no determinate conclusions can be drawn from it. Wood replies, the meaning of FH is clear and determinate because the concepts of humanity, or rational nature, and existent end in itself are both reasonably clear and determinate. Well, even if these concepts were reasonably clear, it would also need to be sufficiently clear what counts as respecting humanity or rational nature as an end in itself. And that, I believe, is far from clear. As one example, consider Kant's claim that it's wrong to hasten our death to avoid suffering, since such an act would degrade the humanity in our own person. Kant believed that as rational beings we have an exalted status with a worth that's above any price, a status we must not abandon or treat with disrespect merely for the sake of a lower aim, the avoidance of suffering. We can accept part of Kant's thinking here. If someone chooses to endure great pain for the sake of continuing to use her rational powers, as Freud is said to have refused morphine while he was dying so that he could still think clearly, such fortitude is admirable. But that doesn't show that if Freud had taken morphine or hastened his death, his act would have shown disrespect for his status as a rational being. Of those who've shown such fortitude when suffering, some were Stoics, who believed that we have more dignity if we make a rational choice about when and how we die. That is more plausible than the view that in making such choices we fail to respect our dignity as rational beings. Kant himself said, in the Stoics' principle concerning suicide there lay much sublimity of soul, that we may depart from life as we leave a smoky room. I think the original phrase was, if your tent smokes, leave. As Wood writes when he rejects Kant's claims about suicide, we disagree here because we justifiably believe that we know more about what respect for humanity requires in these matters. Consider next Kant's claim that in telling a lie even to achieve a really good end, such as deceiving a would-be murderer about where his intended victim is, the liar violates the dignity of humanity in his own person. Kant similarly claims that in giving ourselves sexual pleasure, we defile our humanity. In rejecting both these claims, we must again disagree with Kant about what respecting humanity requires. Kant is right to insist that we should always regard people with respect for their dignity as rational beings. But that claim is too vague, I think, to help us to answer difficult questions about the wrongness of acts. There's another way to interpret this part of Kant's view. Our rationality, Kant claims, has a worth that's unconditional and above all price, and Thomas Hill takes such claims to imply a rather substantive value judgment with significant practical implications. He writes, Kant's view implies that pleasure and the alleviation of pain, even gross misery, have mere price, never to be placed above the value of rationality in persons. On this view, Hill suggests, we act wrongly if we do anything that would reduce anyone's rationality or interfere with rational activities merely for the sake of preventing suffering. According to Cardinal and Newman, though both sin and pain are bad, sin is infinitely worse, so that if all mankind suffered extremist agony for all eternity, that would be less bad than if one venial sin were committed. Though that view is horrific, we can understand why it's been held. I think we can see how sin could seem infinitely worse than pain. If Kant had claimed that the relief of suffering should never be placed above a goodwill, moral value, his view would be as understandable as Newman's. But on Hill's reading, what Kant claims to have such infinitely greater value isn't moral goodness, but rationality. On this view, it would be wrong to save mankind from extremist agony at the cost of making one person less able to play chess or solve crossword puzzles. It's hard to believe that Kant held such a view. Not much more. Return now to the consent principle, which I believe to be the most important part of Kant's formula of ends in themselves, though not, I've said, the only part. In applying this principle, I've assumed one view about rationality of reasons. Many people, as I've said, hold other views. While reasons are provided by the facts, what we could rationally do depends on our beliefs. If we know the relevant facts, as I shall suppose throughout these lectures, we are rational insofar as we respond to reasons or rational requirements. There are two main kinds of view about practical reasons. According to desire-based or aim-based theories, these reasons are provided by our present desires or aims. What we have most reason to do is whatever would best fulfill these desires or aims. According to value-based theories, reasons are provided by facts about what's relevantly good or worth achieving. Now, such theories can differ greatly. According to the self-interest theory, it's our own well-being that's most worth achieving, and we have most reason to do whatever would be best for ourselves. According to another simple theory, which we can call rationalist utilitarianism, we have most reason to do whatever would, on the whole, benefit people most. Now, those two theories are monistic, appealing to only one kind of reason and giving us all a single ultimate aim. Sidgwick combined these theories. On his view, we always have sufficient reason both to do whatever would be best for ourselves and to do whatever would benefit people most. When one act would be best for ourselves but another would benefit people most, we have sufficient reason to act in either way. Either act would be rational. This view Sidgwick called the dualism of practical reason. We ought, I believe, to accept a wider pluralistic view. Though we have strong reasons to care about our own and other people's well-being, there are other practical reasons and other things that are relevantly good or worth achieving. Nor should we assume that only outcomes are relevantly good. Some things are worth doing for their own sakes. And this view is pluralistic in another way. Though it's often clear what we have most reason to want and to do, there are also many cases in which we have sufficient reason to have and to try to achieve any of two or more conflicting aims. In such cases, it would be rational for us to try to achieve any of these aims. We can call this a wide value-based view. Now, many people now accept desire-based theories. In economics and the other social sciences, rationality is often defined in a desire-based or preference-based way. Of those who accept desire-based theories, many also accept the self-interest theory, since these people falsely assume that each of us would always care most about our own well-being. If so many people believe that all reasons are provided by desires, how could it be true that, as I've claimed, no reasons are provided by desires? How could all these people be so mistaken? Well, that's very well discussed in the first chapter of Thomas Scanlon's What We Owe to Each Other. But I shall here say this. One explanation is that in most cases, these two kinds of theory partly agree. Even on value-based theories, we have some reason to fulfill most of our desires, since what we want is usually in some way worth achieving. But though these theories agree that we have some reason to fulfill these desires, they make conflicting claims about what these reasons are and how strong they are. On desire-based theories, our reasons to fulfill these desires are provided not by our having these desires, are provided by these desires. On value-based theories, these reasons are provided not by our having these desires, but by the facts that give us reasons to have them. If some aim is worth achieving, we have a reason both to have this aim and to try to achieve it. Since our reason for acting is the same as our reason for having the desire on which we act, this desire isn't itself part of this reason, and we'd have this reason even if we didn't have this desire. Second, even on value-based theories, there are certain other reasons that we wouldn't have if we didn't have certain desires. But though these reasons depend on our desires, they too are not provided by them. They're provided by other facts that depend on our having these desires. When we have some desire, for example, it may be true that this desire's fulfillment would give us pleasure, or that its non-fulfillment would be distressing or distracting. In such cases, it would be these other facts, and not the fact that we had these desires, that gave us reasons to fulfill them. On desire-based theories, we cannot have reasons to care about anything for its own sake. All reasons to have some desire must be provided by some desire, and that must be some other desire. We can have a reason to want something to happen if its happening would have effects that we want. But we cannot have any reason to have any intrinsic desire or ultimate aim, something we want for its own sake. We cannot have such reasons, for example, to want ourselves or others not to suffer or die. Well, that bleak view is seldom defended. Most desire-based theorists simply take it for granted that we can't have reasons to want anything for its own sake. I was baffled why that's taken for granted, but I now think there's one main argument for this view, which may be explaining its very wide acceptance. Of those who hold this view, many are naturalists who believe that there cannot be any irreducibly normative truths. These people give reductive accounts of desire-based reasons for acting. On these accounts, when we have a reason to act in some way, that normative truth is the same as the fact that this act would fulfill one of our desires, or the fact that after informed deliberation we'd be motivated to act in this way. Now, desire-based reasons, so understood, merely involve causal or psychological facts, which fit in a scientific, naturalistic worldview. value-based reasons cannot be so easily reduced to natural facts. Reductive naturalism is, I believe, mistaken. I may have said scientific worldview. I should have said scientistic worldview. Scientists needn't hold a naturalist view. But I can't defend that belief here. So if you're naturalists, I must ask you to suppose that we can have reasons to care about some things for their own sake. Though I call these theories value-based, that's in a way misleading. As Thomas Scanlon claims, things are good or bad by having certain other properties which, in certain contexts, would give us certain reasons. It's reason-giving properties or facts that are fundamental. If we accept a desire-based theory, as I've said, we must reject the consent principle. It's clear that in earthquake, we ought to save Black's life rather than your leg. But on desire-based theories, if you preferred us to save your leg and you'd keep that preference after informed deliberation, you couldn't rationally consent to our saving Black's life. If we accept the self-interest theory, similar claims apply. If it would be worse for you if we failed to save your leg, you couldn't consent, so our act is wrong. Now, as I say, if we accept either of those theories, we must reject Kant's claim that we must treat people only in ways to which they could rationally consent. On those views, that's clearly false. Suppose, however, that, as I believe, we ought to accept a wide value-based view. The consent principle might then be true or justified. The principle is intrinsically plausible. If people couldn't rationally consent to being treated in some way, that gives us reason to believe that the act is wrong. And I believe that in many kinds of case, this principle has plausible implications. Someone might now object, your claims about rational consent merely reflect your moral views. When you believe that people could rationally consent to being treated in certain ways, that's because you believe that these acts would be right. Those who disagree would claim that, in their opinion, people couldn't rationally consent to these acts. Well, if that objection were justified, the consent principle would be trivial. Whenever we asked whether people could rationally consent to some act, our answer would depend on whether we believed that the act was right, so the principle couldn't help us to decide which acts are right. Well, this objection is, I believe, mistaken. Remember first that in applying this principle, we ask what people could rationally consent to on non-moral grounds, or in a way that sets aside our beliefs about the rightness of acts. Second, our beliefs about non-moral rationality may conflict with or fail to support our moral beliefs. Return to the comparison between tunnel and bridge. Many people would believe that though it would be right to save the five in a way whose side effect is to kill White, it would be wrong to save the five by killing White. But these people should admit that if White could rationally consent to being killed as a side effect of our saving the five, White could also rationally consent to being killed as a means. White would have no reason to prefer one of these ways of being killed. I mean, if anything, it might be better for White to be killed as a means, since her death would then at least do some good. That's not a very serious remark. Though these people believe that it would be wrong to kill White as a means, I think they have to admit that the consent principle doesn't condemn this act. Since our beliefs about rational consent may conflict with our moral beliefs, the consent principle is far from trivial, and it may help to support our moral beliefs. If it does that well enough, we could justifiably let this principle guide our beliefs by revising some and extending others. In some cases, however, this principle has implications that may be hard to accept. And that may be true in bridge. Could the five rationally consent on non-moral grounds to our failing to save their lives by killing White? Well, it's not clear that they could, and if they couldn't, the consent principle wouldn't merely fail to condemn our killing White as a means, it would imply that we ought to do that. And many of us would find that hard to believe. Return next to earthquake, in which we could save either Black's life or your leg. Now, while you could rationally consent to our saving Black's life, Black, I believe, couldn't rationally consent to our saving your leg. The consent principle gives the right answer here, since it's clear that we ought to save Black's life. But suppose that in a variant of this case, it's you who could act in either of these ways. Could Black rationally consent to your saving your leg rather than Black's life? Well, the answer may be no. If the choice were Black, she couldn't rationally save your leg rather than her own life. And if she couldn't rationally act in this way, it's not clear that she could rationally consent on non-moral grounds to your acting in that way. And if Black couldn't rationally give such consent, the consent principle implies that it would be wrong for you to save your leg rather than Black's life. And we may find that hard to believe. While it's clear that we ought to save Black's life rather than your leg, since that would cost us nothing, we may doubt that you ought to sacrifice your leg to save Black's life. Suppose that in a third version of this case, it's not you but your child whose leg is threatened. Could Black rationally consent to your saving your child's leg rather than Black's life? As before, it's not clear that she could, and if she couldn't, the consent principle implies that you ought to save Black's life rather than your own child's leg. And we may find that hard to believe. Well, if the consent principle conflicts too strongly with some of our moral beliefs, we could respond in two ways. We might revise this principle by weakening its claims. On this revised principle, if some act would treat people in ways to which they couldn't rationally consent, that counts strongly against this act, making it, in Ross's phrase, prima facie wrong. But in some cases, such an act might be justified on other grounds. As a parent, you may have a special obligation to protect your own child from harm, and that might morally outweigh your reason to save Black's life. And though you have no such obligation to protect yourself, there may be limits on the sacrifices that anyone has a duty to make for the greater good of others. Then the consent principle may still do a lot of work, but we need sometimes to override it. There's another, more Kantian response. The consent principle applies directly to particular acts. We might revise this principle so that it applies not to acts, but to the principles which we apply to acts. On this revised higher order principle, we ought to act on the principles whose acceptance everyone could rationally consent. Could we all consent to a principle that required parents to give no priority to saving their own children from harm? The answer may be no, and that might explain why you could rationally save your child's leg rather than Black's life. One of my aims in the next two lectures is to explore this second response. The consent principle, I've claimed, is the most valuable part of Kant's formula of ends in themselves. But Kant proposes some other formulas. Like the consent principle, some of these formulas apply directly to particular acts, but others apply to the choice of principles on which we act. These other formulas have inspired several versions of contractualism, such as those proposed by Rawls and Scanlon. Some of Kant's formulas, I shall argue, fail, and that's true of the formulas to which Kant himself gives most weight. But if we revise one of Kant's other formulas and appeal to a wide value-based view about reasons, we reach another version of contractualism, and this, I believe, might be the supreme moral law.
We have three distinguished commentators who are joining us for this week's events. Each of these commentators will make some remarks after one of Derek Parfit's lectures, and then all three commentators will offer additional observations at the Thursday seminar. Today's commentator is Professor Alan Wood, who is the Ward W. and Priscilla B. Woods Professor of Philosophy at Stanford, where he has taught since 1999. Prior to that, he taught for 3 years at Yale and for 28 years at Cornell. Professor Wood is a prolific scholar who is an expert on 18th and 19th century German philosophy and whose many writings include, in addition to books on Hegel and Marx, 3 books on Kant: Kant's Moral Religion, published in 1970, Kant's Rational Theology, published in 1978, and Kant's Ethical Thought, published in 1999. Professor Wood is also a distinguished editor and translator of Kant's works. We're very fortunate to have him with us this week. Professor Wood.
I requested that I comment on Derek Parfit's first lecture because it seemed to me the one with which I would have the most to disagree. I think I am in substantial agreement with him on some other matters in the other lectures, especially the second, where many Kantians would strongly want to disagree. Even in the first lecture, there are some points in which I strongly agree with him, especially in his arguments in favor of values-based theories of practical reason and against desire-based theories. But today's comments will focus mainly on themes where I either dissent from what he says or at least feel uncertain about it. Parfit identifies as Kant's best-loved statement of the moral law the formula of ends in themselves, or as I will prefer to call it, the formula of humanity. The formula of humanity is surely the formula Kant is most fond of citing in justification of the duties he specifies in his work of applied practical philosophy, The Metaphysics of Morals. In today's lecture, Parfit traces out his favorite way of applying the formula of humanity, which involves what he calls the consent principle. The favored form of the consent principle appears to be this: it is wrong to treat people in any way to which they could not rationally consent because they could not rationally share the purpose with which we act. Parfit argues that in order to avoid triviality, this must mean that the rational consent or non-consent must be based on non-moral grounds. He apparently intends to use some version of the consent principle to explore a version of contractualism that he finds attractive. But I think the consent principle does not at all capture the main idea behind the formula of humanity and does not yield either a very Kantian or a very good way of dealing with moral questions. There is one formulation of the moral principle where Kant does seem to employ something like rational consent as a moral criterion. It occurs in the Critique of Practical Reason. Kant considers various immoral ways of acting and then invites us to consider the state of affairs where they were regarded as permissible. If you belong to such an order of things, he asks, would you be in it with the agreement, Einstimmung, of your will? Neither here nor anywhere else does he say what criteria we would use in deciding which orders of things our will could agree to be part of. For me, it is easiest to make sense of this formulation by reading it simply as another way of asking the more typical Kantian question, whether you would have conflicting volitions if you tried to will such an order of things as universal law. I read his question, would you be in it with the agreement of your will, as equivalent to, if you tried to will yourself a part of it, would you find yourself caught in conflicting volitions? Kantian questions of that kind, of course, are famously perplexing, too. Almost the sole textual basis Parfit himself uses for interpreting the formula of humanity through the consent principle is found in Kant's discussion of the example of the false promise in the groundwork. Quote, him whom I want to use for my own purposes by such a promise cannot possibly agree, einstimmen, to my way of behaving toward him, and so himself contain the end of his action. End of quote. In this remark itself, the stress is less on the possibility of agreement than on the idea that Parfit treats as the reason for requiring rational consent, i.e., in the specific case of the false promise, being able to agree to the way you are treated is a way of restating the more basic condition that the patient be able to share the agent's end. This, in turn, is just Kant's way of anticipating the different formula, the formula of the realm of ends, which tells us to act only on those principles to which there could arise a realm or a harmonious system of all the ends of rational beings. Yet it is by no means clear that Kant regards being able to agree to the way you are treated as a necessary condition for the consistency of the treatment with the realm of ends. For example, Kant says that a criminal cannot rationally will his own punishment, but he clearly regards the punishment of crime as something consistent with the realm of ends. Though it might apply to other cases beside the false promise, for example, to cases of coercion, being able to agree to the way you are treated is never presented by Kant as a general condition for being treated as an end in itself. It is not mentioned in connection with any of the other three duties that belong to the Kantian taxonomy, nor does it seem natural to argue from the formula of humanity to any of those other duties by way of the consent principle. Particularly un-Kantian in spirit, it seems to me, is Parfit's version of the consent principle restricting the grounds of rational consent to non-moral ones. This seems much more at home in the utilitarian-type project of deriving the moral principle from calculations about how best to pursue non-moral ends. I'm not at all sure, by the way, that including moral grounds of consent would trivialize moral contractualism. It would not if the point of contractualism is merely to find a perspicuous way of presenting our moral intuitions. Quite apart from Kant or the formula of humanity, I confess I have a hard time making sense of the questions on which Parfit wants to support conclusions about his examples following the consent principles. For example, I know for sure that I would not want my leg amputated even to save Black's life. But could I or should I consent to it? I can make sense of the thought that I might have to consent to it on moral grounds. I might have a duty to consent to it because of the moral claim made on me by the value of saving Black's life. But if I'm asked if I would or should consent to it, entirely in abstraction from moral considerations, I can see no reason at all why I should consent, or for that matter, why I should not consent to it as distinct from just not wanting to lose my leg. Parfit insists that our beliefs about what we can rationally consent to overlap with, but are distinct from, our moral beliefs, and he offers some examples in support of this. I do not share his intuitions about these examples, nor am I even clear about what these are supposed to be intuitions about. Parfit says that if White could rationally consent to being killed as a side effect of our saving 5 people, then White should also rationally consent to being killed as a means. This is only a conditional claim about intuitions concerning what White could or should consent to, but I do not see why it should be self-evidently true. As before, I don't see how, except on moral grounds, White can answer the question whether she consents to being killed in order to save 5 others. On purely self-interested grounds, she surely won't want to be killed, even to save 100 others or 1,000,000 others. Suppose, despite this, that she can consent to it on some other, still unspecified non-moral grounds. Even so, White might feel insulted by the thought that she's being killed as a means, but not at the thought that she's being killed as a side effect. If so, she might not consent to being killed as a means. Parfit suggests that that would make her death more meaningful. I still do not see that it would have to make it more meaningful. It might merely seem an insulting way to die. Even so, why should that consideration have to move her to consent entirely on non-moral grounds? Questions about consent, it seems to me, arise most naturally where people are trying to agree on some course of action in governing their collective behavior. Thus, I can imagine everyone's deciding to consent on non-moral grounds to an arrangement from which everyone would benefit. But I cannot make sense of that suggestion that there would be a rational way of deciding when to consent or not to consent, merely on non-moral grounds, to some arrangement for distributing burdens and benefits in cases where people's interests are directly in conflict, as they are in all the examples Parfit discusses. On non-moral grounds, I would consent to those arrangements that would benefit me and those I happen to care about, and to refuse consent to arrangements that would harm them. I wouldn't expect these tendencies to track very well what is fair or morally reasonable, and I couldn't offer them to others with a straight face as moral reasons for favoring arrangements from which I or my friends unfairly benefit over fairer arrangements that are less favorable to me and mine. What I might reasonably consent to on non-moral grounds might also depend on the strength or weakness of my bargaining position, and this would not necessarily track fairness or moral reasonableness either. For these reasons, the consent principle makes sense to me only if it is taken in a way that Parfit says would trivialize it. Parfit suggests further that there is a complex relationship between what it is rational to will and what morality requires that might underwrite a contractualist morality. On Wednesday, he will cite further examples in which morality seems to favor extreme personal sacrifices, while self-interest strongly opposes making them. He will suggest that it could be rational in such cases either to act as morality favors or to do the self-interested thing. And he will resist the idea that morality's demands should always be seen as rationally overriding. I don't see why we cannot deal perfectly well with such cases by using Kant's distinction between strict or owed duties and wide or meritorious duties. Where it is still reasonable to do the self-interested thing, the duty not to do it cannot be strict. That's why it would still be rational either to do the morally meritorious or to do the self-interested thing. By contrast, where a strict duty requires the sacrifice of self-interest, it is no longer reasonable or rational to do the selfish thing and withhold the sacrifice. No doubt there will be some borderline and some hard cases, but I do not see why we must admit any case in which morality can be rationally overridden by self-interest or by any other non-moral ground. Accordingly, what we can reasonably consent to will always collapse into what morality says we can consent to, and so no understanding of rational consent that Parfit regards as non-trivial can ever generate informative moral principles. Parfit has persuaded me that I should put some of my cards on the table at this point about how I understand reason in some of the above claims. I do not agree with Rawls and others who want to distinguish the rational from the reasonable. This distinction seems to me highly artificial. It wrongly concedes the former term to economists and others whose theories in effect restrict the standards of rationality to those of instrumental reason and some of the thinner and more abstract parts of prudential reason, while simply omitting all the rational standards that matter most to ethics, as though the matters they deal with lie entirely beyond the pale of reason. I regard these omissions as anything but innocent, and I suspect them of being secretly motivated by philosophical prejudices that could not survive the light of day. My position is, while it may or may not be true that the actual is rational and the rational actual, it certainly is true that whatever is rational is also reasonable, and whatever is reasonable is rational. As I read the formula of humanity, what it tells us to do is treat the humanity or rational nature in persons in a way that accords with its worth as an end in itself. That is, something for the sake of which we have an objective reason to act. Kant's thesis that rational nature has dignity, an absolute or incomparable worth that's beyond any price, tells us that the value of rational nature in a person can never be rationally sacrificed by being traded off against other values that are worth more, even against the value of rational nature in another person or persons. I think it is quite clear what this means, but I agree with Parfit that it is not at all evident simply from this principle exactly what kinds of conduct it would permit, require, and forbid. That must depend on a fundamentally hermeneutical inquiry into what various acts under various circumstances signify or express regarding the dignity of rational nature in persons. I see this as no unclarity at all in the formula of humanity itself, but only an indication that we need further moral reasoning, some of it of an interpretive character, if we are to apply the formula of humanity successfully. A few things about treating people in accordance with the dignity of rational nature are fairly clear. We honor rational nature in persons when we promote its development and exercise, and when we harmonize our ends with the ends rationally chosen by persons. This is the basic reason why the principles of morality, ideally carried out, would result in a realm of ends, in which all the ends of rational beings systematically converge and support one another. Since people rationally pursue happiness and shun suffering, it is also a reason why we should seek the happiness of others and the relief of their suffering. Although we also honor rational nature by promoting the development of people's rational capacities, it would be perverse to interpret the formula of humanity as forbidding us, in Parfit's words, interpreting Thomas Hill, quote, to do anything that would reduce anyone's rationality or interfere with rational activities merely for the sake of preventing suffering. as though the formula of humanity implies that any instance of furthering rationality, even in trivial ways, should have strict lexical priority over all instances of preventing even the most widespread and horrible suffering. Regarded as an exercise in interpretation, I think that would rank with reading King Lear as a slapstick comedy. Parfit says that the claim, "we should always regard people with respect for their dignity," is, quote, "too vague to help us to answer difficult questions about the wrongfulness of acts." I think this remark may be true, but even so, it betrays an important error about what should be expected of a fundamental principle of morality. What the formula of humanity does is set forth the fundamental value basis for moral action and judgment. Such a principle should not be expected also to supply the right answer to questions about the rightfulness or wrongfulness of acts, especially in unusual or problematic situations. We certainly should not substitute some other principle for the formula of humanity just because it enables us to deduce answers to these questions that agree with our pre-theoretical intuitions, if that other principle also gives us the wrong fundamental value basis for answering them. Kant clearly does not think that the formula of humanity gives no help at all in deciding what to do. The metaphysics of morals, as I read it, provides us with a strategy for applying it to generate a system of duties. Kant divides the treatment of rational nature in persons as an end in itself into two main spheres: the sphere of right, involving the principles according to which external actions may be permissibly coerced, and the sphere of ethics, involving principles for the setting of ends through freedom. It belongs to the dignity of humanity not to be constrained by another's choice except through laws consistent with your own rational will. Thus, Kant interprets Ulpian's three legal principles, honeste vive, neminem laede, and suum cuique tribue, as expressions of this idea. They enjoin, respectively, asserting against others one's free status, refraining from violating the free status of another, and entering into a condition in which what rightfully belongs to each may be protected from violation. This last injunction requires us to belong to a civil society that determines and externally enforces the rights of individuals. It is only in the sphere of right that Kant himself is a contractualist. He regards the rational idea of an original contract as a criterion or necessary condition for the justice of a law of the state. For a law to be just, it is required that it might have been agreed to unanimously by all members of the community as part of an ideal original contract. In this context, Kant is interested in what people can rationally agree to, because mutual rational agreement guarantees that people retain their status as externally free agents while entering into relations under which they are subject to coercion. I think it is only because a lying promise transgresses the right of the person lied to that Kant introduces something like the consent principle in connection with it. But it is extremely important to Kant that not all moral relationships involve external right and justified coercion. This is why questions about consent, about what people do or rationally could agree to, are not in general relevant when it comes to deciding what our moral duties are.
Though I prepared some responses to Alan Wood's commentary, I began that only a few hours ago, so they're rather scrappy and disordered. I'd like to start by saying how indebted I am to Wood, who sent me many extremely helpful comments on early drafts. Alan says that there are points on which he strongly agrees with me, especially in my arguments in favor of value-based theories of practical reason and against desire-based theories. But I'm not sure that's so. My kind of value-based theory is, I think, very different from the kind that Alan seems to accept. First, I should comment on something that Alan doesn't say. One of my main claims was that though it may be wrong to kill one person as a means of saving several others, that can't be explained by appealing to two of the main elements in Kant's formula, what I'm calling the mere means principle and the rational consent principle. Now, Alan didn't question these claims. That may be in part because he gives little weight to the mere means principle. In his recent book, Allen writes, "The phrase 'never merely as a means' actually plays no role whatever in the actual content of Kant's formula. The entire force of the formula is the claim that we should treat people as ends in themselves. If we do that, we've avoided treating them merely as a means." So on Wood's reading, the formula tells us only to treat all rational beings as ends in themselves. Well, I think the mere means principle has more importance than that. First, it's worth keeping the idea that we should never regard rational beings merely as a means. Second, since the phrase "as ends in themselves" has no ordinary meaning, we must make further claims about what's required for treating people in this way. And Kant seems to claim plausibly that at least part of what's involved in treating people as ends is not treating them merely as a means. Now, if that's so, we're back with the question of whether that claim implies that it's wrong to kill or injure one person as a means of saving others from greater burdens. Now, many writers answer yes, that's the standard way of rejecting this implication of a consequentialist view. I've argued that that just isn't true, and I wonder whether Alan agrees.
I'm not sure.
Okay, right. Well, I turn now to Alan's main subject, the rational consent principle. Alan says that this doesn't at all capture the main idea behind Kant's formula, nor does it yield a good way of dealing with, or a very good way of dealing with moral questions. Well, the sole textual basis for attributing this to Kant, he claims, is the remark that if I make someone a lying promise, Kant writes, this person could not possibly agree to my treatment of him. Now, I think there are some other remarks which suggest that principle, but one remark is enough. I mean, look at the amount that's based on Kant's one claim that some maxims can't even be conceived to be universal laws without contradiction. Hundreds of pages on that claim. However, how else might we interpret Kant's claim? Sorry, I've got this in the wrong order. There are other ways of interpreting that claim. Korsgaard and O'Neill claim that people can't possibly agree to our treatment of them, what Kant says is the objection, unless we both give them the knowledge required for consent and power over the proceedings. People can't possibly agree in that sense if we deny them the opportunity to choose whether we treat them in this way. That's what I call the veto principle. And that principle is wholly unacceptable, nor does Kant accept it. He didn't believe that whenever we can, we must give others the power to choose how we treat them. Well, how else might we interpret Kant's claim that we shouldn't treat people in ways to which they could not possibly agree? If we're not required to give them a veto, we might ask whether, if we gave them a veto, they could possibly agree. But that would be trivial. Of course they could agree. We need to ask whether they could rationally agree. That's the only version of it that gives us a principle worth considering. So I think that is the best interpretation of the claim. Well, Alan cites against that reading Kant's claim that a criminal cannot rationally will his own punishment, though Kant didn't conclude, therefore, that punishment is wrong. Well, I think this was one of Kant's mistakes. Many criminals, I believe, could rationally will that they be punished or consent to their punishment. I think Kant would have agreed to that, actually. And when they couldn't rationally consent, that's often because their punishment has features that also make it wrong. I turn now to Wood's main doubts about the consent principle. These partly rest on my claim that in applying this principle, we should ask what people could rationally consent to on non-moral grounds or for reasons other than those provided by the rightness of acts. Now, without that restriction, I said it would be trivial to claim that we should act only in ways to which people could rationally consent, because we could always claim they could rationally consent since it's permissible. Now, Wood doesn't question my claim that unless we appeal to consent on non-moral grounds, the principle is trivial. I'm trying to see if we can get a non-trivial version of Kant's claim. And we should note we need a similar restriction on Kant's formula of universal law. When Kant asked whether his lying promiser could rationally will that his maxim be a universal law, he doesn't intend us to answer no on the ground that lying promises are wrong and no one could rationally will that people act wrongly. Such claims only have any significance if you exclude appeals to the wrongness of acts. Well, Rudd writes, I confess I have a hard time making sense of the questions on which Parfit wants to support his conclusions. Well, my question is whether we have sufficient reason to consent to being treated in some way. And Wood, I think, should agree that that makes sense, even if he believes that in my examples we don't have sufficient reasons when I claim that we do. Now, I asked whether in earthquake you could rationally consent to our saving Black's life rather than your leg. Alan says, I can make sense of the thought that I might have to consent to it on moral grounds, but if I'm asked whether I would or should consent entirely in abstraction from moral considerations, I see no reason at all why I should consent, or for that matter, not consent. Well, that misstates my question. I wasn't asking whether you should consent, whether you ought rationally to. I was asking whether you could rationally. That makes a great difference. On my view, you're not rationally required to sacrifice a leg to save a stranger's life, but you could rationally do that. Well, we've now reached the central disagreement, and this is an issue that runs through the next two lectures as well. What I'm trying to do is to see what happens to certain of the central arguments and claims in morality if we apply to them a view about rationality and reasons which has been generally ignored or rejected, but which seems to me correct. Now, I said to appeal to the consent principle, we must reject standard views, which are either desire-based or self-interested. And Wood, I think, seems to accept such a view. He says, on non-moral grounds, I would consent to these arrangements that would benefit me and those I happen to care about. Well, if his reasons for consenting are given either by the benefits to him or by the fact that he cares about them, those are self-interested or desire-based reasons. Wood says that if we're appealing to non-moral reasons, he can see no reason why he should consent. Well, I think he has a strong reason for consenting, which is provided by the fact that rather than saving his leg, we'd be saving someone else's life. I have a very good reason to care about that. And I think Wood could rationally sacrifice his life to save someone's leg, even if we assume he's in no way morally required to do that. Similarly, Wood says, I don't see how, except on moral grounds, White can answer the question whether she could rationally consent. Now, that makes the disagreement between us look bigger than it is. Wood later claims that we can perfectly well deal with such cases by using Kant's distinction between strict and meritorious duties. When I could sacrifice my leg to save someone's life, Wood might claim that I have a meritorious duty to save this person's life, but because it isn't strict, I could either rationally do what's best for me or do the morally meritorious thing. Now, that claim doesn't conflict with mine, but Wood continues, and so no understanding of rational consent that Parfit regards as non-trivial can ever generate informative moral principles. And that doesn't follow. For the consent principle to avoid triviality, we can't appeal to the claim that you could rationally consent to some treatment because it's justified or right. Wood may be entitled to claim that morality itself says that we could rationally make such a sacrifice, but that would only make the consent principle trivial if that was the only way of defending the claim that I could rationally save someone else's life rather than my leg. Unless I'm doing it on moral grounds, I don't have sufficient reason to do it. And that, I believe, just isn't true. Now, in making that claim, I'm, as I say, rejecting this dominant view. And we should note it's accepted even by Kantians, such as wooden rules. On this view, we have deliberative and instrumental rationality over here, with possibly self-instituted rationality. And then the other extreme, we have morality and moral requirements, and there's nothing in between. Kant makes very little use of the concept of non-moral goodness or badness, as is shown by his denial that it's bad to be in pain. And as many Kantians claim, on this view, states of affairs are not the possible bearers of value. Can't be defensibly claimed to be in itself worse, for example, if an earthquake kills or injures more people or disease causes more suffering. Now, I believe that's worse, and it's worse in the sense that everyone has some reason to want that not to happen. And that isn't because of their moral beliefs. That's the fundamental question. Do we have reasons to care about what happens? Unless, morality requires us to do so. However, let me end with another remark. One of the things that makes Kant such a great philosopher is that different people can be inspired by his remarks in so many different ways. Wood responds by asking, what are the ways in which our acts can best express respect for the absolute dignity of rational nature? I respond by asking which are the acts to which, on non-moral grounds, we could all consent. And those are both worth developing. They're not in conflict with one another. We should develop them both. In moral philosophy, it's still very early days, I think.
Okay, that's my first question. I want to ask three questions. You guys, I listened to you for an hour and a half. You gotta listen to me for three questions. So that's the first question. What are the grounds of rational consent? And if they are genuinely wide open, really wide open, then it looks like just about anything is going to go, depending on the personal idiosyncrasies of the people involved. I won't go through the details of describing the psychology of what it would be like for a person to rationally consent to his or her own rape, but I leave it to your own imagination. Given certain kinds of personalities, I can well imagine such a person. I can even imagine a person who would consent in advance to an action that he or she would not consent to on the spot. So it looks like if you don't tell us anything about what's going to count as the grounds of rational consent, other than these are just facts. Any old facts could be a ground of rational consent. And then it's going to look like anything goes. And my third question is more broad. Maybe you want to save it for subsequent lectures. But that is, why don't you make the obvious move? The obvious move is that the Kantian conception of universality requires us that we consider these cases without regard to our own special interests. So I can give you a ground why White would rationally consent to, on Kantian grounds, to her own death, but it is of the form, well, what principle would I choose if I didn't know if I was going to be the one on the isolated island or the one of the five? That is, the universality requires that I subtract my own special interests. Those are my three questions.
Well, I shall be discussing the second tomorrow. But, I mean, the main effect of the first two, I think, is should we try and reach conclusions about these questions in a way that assumes that we can't have reasons to care about things for their own sake? Now, I think we can have such reasons, and I think most non-academics would find it really bizarre to think that you can't have reasons to care about things for their own sake. Now, I think your suggestion was that if I have a reason to care about Black's death, that's on moral grounds. Now, it isn't because I'm morally required to do it. It may be because, as Alan says, morality says that I can rationally consent to that. Well, I think we can more easily explain why I can rationally consent to that by giving a different account of the whole of reasons and rationality. Now, you said at one point, if you're appealing to rational consent, everything is open, any facts count. I don't think that at all. People do consent to things that they can't rationally consent to because they don't have sufficient reason to consent. So that's what it comes to. Shall we, continue, as it were, to cycle on this tightrope with this bandage over our eyes so that we can't see a large part of the area? Or should we follow through the thought that we can have reasons to care? Reasons to want to try to achieve certain things. And not because morality says that, okay, it's not irrational for you to do that.
Morality says it, but those reasons are, for a lot of us, eo ipso, moral reasons.
Oh, that is because on the fundamental assumptions about reasons and rationality that have dominated these disciplines for 200 years, there's nothing in the middle. There's desire-based, instrumental, possibly self-interested, and then morality. And there's nothing in the middle. And one way in which it's shown that there's nothing in the middle is that on this view about morality, you can't give sense to the thought that it's worse if more people suffer or die. Now, sorry.
Jay Wallace.
I just think I wanted to follow up this question a little bit. The background conception of rationality that you're appealing to, I guess I'm struck, among other things, by the fact that it seems, as you say, rational. It seems an intelligible response to reasons for White to sacrifice his life in order to save 5 people. That seems to me to be connected to the fact that we describe such an action as an action of heroic beneficence in some way. So our conception that it's an appropriate response it's perhaps not a translation of the idea that it's morally required, but it seems to be in some ways responsive to our broadly moral concepts, if I can just complete the thought. In a different kind of case where White might save 5 people by himself killing someone else, we wouldn't obviously think that is an appropriate response to reasons, in part because it wouldn't in the same way be described as an act of heroic beneficence or in a way that would involve other kinds of moral concepts.
I agree.
It just seems like these intuitions about what an appropriate response is to the values that bear are in some ways conditioned by moral intuitions we have. I don't know if that's a problem for your position, but it suggests that what we're appealing to, and I share your sense that it's a mistake to think in overly dichotomized terms, such that there's the self-interested reasons over here and the moral reasons over here and nothing in between. But it does raise a question about whether what you're appealing to in appealing to intuitions about whether actions would be rational or appropriate responses to reasons might not be things that are in some ways conditioned by broadly moral intuitions. That's one question I have. The other question I would have is just a more general one. It's not obvious to me that intuitions about what it would be rational for an agent to do translate very easily into intuitions about what it would be rational for an agent to consent to, or into intuitions about what a rational agent should want in general terms. I'm not actually sure I have a grip on what the second question is. This is not necessarily helpful to Kant, but it's not obvious to me that you cannot just go from the fact that, let's say, it would be rational for White to sacrifice himself heroically in a given situation in order to save 5 other people, that it would be rational for him to consent to being killed to make that possible. Reasons for action might be, distinctively reasons for action that don't have direct and uncomplicated implications for questions that are anyway elusive about what you could rationally consent to or will.
Well, with response to the first, I agree that if people think that someone could rationally sacrifice themselves to save 5 other people, then they're going to need to defend that. And one way of defending it is saying that morality implies that it's rational, or another is to say, well, it's rational because it's an act of heroic beneficence. Now, we have to be careful about beneficence, because that's doing good, and this theory doesn't appeal to the notion of good that I'm appealing to. So I agree, if we appeal to people's actual intuitions, and these people accept desire-based or self-interested accounts of rationality, with moral requirements as the other extreme, then their intuitions are going to take this form. Now, your second question goes right to the center of it, because you said people can rationally act in some way, but that doesn't imply that they could rationally consent to other people doing it, nor does it imply that they can rationally want it to be done. Those are quite different. Now, I think the fundamental practical reasons aren't reasons for acting, which are given by our desires. They're reasons for having the desires on which we act. One and the same facts give us reasons both to want and to try to achieve something. So that's why I connect the two much more closely. But I'm not appealing to ordinary academics' intuitions, because ordinary academics accept, most of them, a very different view. I think the non-academic public is different. But,
One question and one comment disguised as a question. To begin with the latter, I think you did not directly address the question of what Kant's own answer to the three cases at hand would have been. And I think if I confine myself to the bridge case, his answer would be that both choices would have been flatly immoral, which is just to say that the issue at hand is not to be decided on moral grounds. Of course, we have to make a choice, but his so-called moral rigorism is basically a conceptual affair. It says, in effect, make your choice, if necessary, on non-moral grounds, on utilitaristic grounds, but don't call your choice a moral one in such cases where none of the options is complies with the categorical imperative. So my question is, perhaps you answered that, but then I missed it. It's about the mere means principle. Do you allow for counterfactual reading of the mere means principle in the following way? If I treat someone as a mere means or not, should not depend on which options are actually open to me. It should suffice that if I were given the opportunity to limit the harm I did to White,
yeah.
I would have chosen so.
That's exactly what I said. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
then okay. For the fact that I didn't have the opportunity should not make the mere means principle less convincing.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
exactly what I said. Yeah. Yeah. Now, with response to the first, although it's very important to try and decide what Kant meant and what Kant believed, because he's the greatest modern moral philosopher, my main interest is what we can do with his ideas. And asking what Kant himself would have thought about these three cases, I think not very helpful.
Well, on the basis of his philosophy, of course.
Well, no, because Kant's own particular moral views were strikingly unconnected with his moral principles.
Jerry Dworkin. You seem to move from the premise that it would be a trivial matter to try to answer the question of what we could rationally consent to by appealing to the rightness and wrongness of acts, which seems to me correct, to the conclusion that therefore we have to appeal to non-moral grounds. Now, it's obvious that there are other moral terms beside rightness and wrongness which seem to be quite conclusory. For example, the fact that an act would be vicious, or that an act would be unkind, or that an act would be unjust. Do you have some reason for supposing that it's bad methodologically to use some parts of morality to build up the system so that it would be certainly non-trivial, although it would certainly be the case that you couldn't reduce moral questions to non-moral ones?
No, I had no objection to that. On the other hand, if those terms have implications about the wrongness, if the claim that it's unjust requires that it be wrong, because if it wasn't wrong, it wouldn't be unjust, then that would fall under the ban. But as long as the quasi-moral claims that you're appealing to don't themselves depend on assumptions about the wrongness of act, it can be worth doing. I agree.
So it could entail that it was wrong, but...
Well, no, because if the claim that the act was unjust would only be true if the act was wrong, then you can't then argue that it's wrong because it's unjust. It's got to be independent.
Chris Coots.
I was wondering if you might say a little more about what room there is in your preferred conception of reason for considerations of perspective or agent relativity. And in particular, I was puzzled by one of the claims you make about your discussion of earthquake. You say, if the choice were blacks, you ask, could black rationally consent to your saving your leg rather than black's life? The answer may be no, you say. If the choice were black's, she could not rationally save your leg rather than her own life. And then you go on, if black could not rationally act in this way herself, it's not clear that she could rationally consent on non-moral grounds to your acting in this way. Now, it seems to me you intend those two questions to be very different. It can't, second one can't be simply, could black rationally consent to its being the case that your leg is, or her life is taken rather than your leg, or whichever way around it is. But if that's so, if it's meant to apply differently, it doesn't seem to me why there's not a non-moral basis for black to rationally consent to your saving your leg at the cost of her life. For she might rationally consent to the following proposition: it's reasonable for you to sacrifice, or it's reasonable for you to save your leg at the cost of her life. That doesn't strike me as building in a moral consideration, but it nonetheless recognizes the special importance your leg has to you.
Yes, but I think, that is in a way getting her not to consent to your act, but whether she would consent to a principle that permits such acts. And in consenting to that principle, she's going to be reasoning in a way that's more distinctively moral. It'd be more relevant to say, we can't reasonably require people to make certain kinds of sacrifice. That's why I said of the two responses in these cases, one is to move up a level and to apply claims about rational consent to principles rather than to particular acts. Now, I thought your first point was important and relevant. Can you just remind me what it was very quickly?
Did I have 2 points? The first point, well, the point was that the conception of reason ought to make room for agent relativity.
Oh, yes. Well, it certainly does. I began by saying that the very simplest version of the kind of view I'm appealing to is Sidgwick's. And he took an extreme version of this view because he seemed to have thought that you always had sufficient reason to do what would be best from an impartial point of view, but you always had sufficient reason to do whatever would be best for you. Now, in allowing that you always have sufficient reason to do whatever is best for you, that's giving great weight to what you have reason to do from a personal, partial, agent-relative point of view. The point is, he thought that you weren't required to act on those reasons because you could also rationally act. Now, perhaps I should say that Sidgwick regarded the conflict here, as he called it, the dualism of practical reasons, as a disaster. That's why when people said, Henry, you must be delighted now that your great book is out, he said, the first word in my book is ethics, and the last is failure, because he couldn't resolve this. Now, I actually think his conception was much too crude. There aren't two wholly different points of view, an impartial point of view and a personal point of view. Nor is well-being the only thing that matters, nor do we have these exceptionally strong reasons to care about our own well-being. If you complicate the picture, you can perhaps avoid the starkness of Sidgwick's view. But if you ask, why did he think that practical reason couldn't solve such cases, it's precisely because he thought the question asked from a personal point of view was so different from the question asked from an impartial point of view. So recognizing that distinction is very much a part of this.
Right, I guess my suggestion then was that you might recognize that perspective without making the move all the way to the question of what principles might be endorsable. I might be able to recognize that the importance of that perspective with respect to this act of by the other person choosing to save his own leg.
Yes, but there are lots of reasons for and against in different cases, looking at the act or looking at the principle, and that just raises lots of questions, some of which I'll be returning to.
Yes.
Just wondering if you would help to consider a version of the lifeboat example where the reasons where they clearly, well, I would think there clearly are non-moral reasons involved. So where it's white on one rock and on the other rock is all the great art and fine art and music of history, etc. For some reason, when the water rises, it's all going to be destroyed. And that's a case where it seems like it might be rational for White to sacrifice himself for the sake of all this great art, but that's clearly an aesthetic value that is an aesthetic reason that's being deployed.
No, I don't think that's an aesthetic reason. I think that's a practical reason given by certain aesthetic facts. The fact that it's so
Sure, but it's aesthetic value, not moral value.
No, it isn't moral value, but then that's why I think it's a mistake to think
Yes.
that if you move apart from desire-based, you only go to moral. If I say that it's worse if an earthquake kills more people, now, morality might tell me that if the earthquake was an agent, the earthquake would be acting wrongly in doing that. But that's not the content of the thought, that it's worse if more people suffer and die. That's a thought which has obvious moral relevance on most views, but it's not directly a thought about morality.
My example is a friendly example.
Well, I think if there's great beauty here, which enriches the lives of, it's not clear that that isn't morally relevant. So I agree, it raises more complicated questions.
But it's not a moral value.
Well, look, let's take a very good example of that kind of conflict. Some 30 years ago, it was pointed out to the French government that if they cut down all these superb avenues of trees on roads in the French countryside, it wouldn't cost anything because they could sell the wood, and it would save something like, given the badness of French driving, it was a large number of lives each year. And the French government decided not to do it. Now, I don't think that that was a case in which it was clear that morally they ought to cut down the trees, but they decided on non-moral grounds not to do that. I don't think that is right.
Ari? If I could get back to the point Chris was making, it seems that in the case of Black, in asking the question, can he rationally consent to losing his life, it seems that so long as the case is he's losing his life, you get to keep your leg, you seem to think he can't rationally consent. Which makes one start to worry that there's some sort of consequentialist principle being built into your intuitions about rational consent, so that it's the consequences that are all that's relevant. So what I'm wondering is, are there any cases in which you would say that the outcome, that given the same outcome, because of, let's say, different people acting or some other reason, that your intuition about what would be rational would be different?
No, I'm glad you asked that, because I had further comments on Alan when I was going to say it. It's very important to see that believing that we can have reasons to care about things, and believing that it can be worse if more people suffer and die, that isn't consequentialism. Of course, consequentialists have to believe things like that, but if we believe things like that, that doesn't mean we're consequentialists. We can often think that from an impartial point of view, we ought not to do what would make the outcome best. No difficulty in that thought. It's just the goodness of the outcome is one relevant consideration. So I don't think any of my claims were in that sense consequentialist, though I shall be returning to the issue that raises.
Yeah, I wanted to question an equation that you made in some of your responses of the idea that non-moral reasons would focus on self-interested reasons, and that they would focus on desire-based reasons, right? Because I think you certainly could have a conception of self-interest that wasn't desire-based, that was value-based.
The self-interest, I presented that as one value-based view. It's a narrow view. It says the only thing that's worth achieving is your own maximum well-being. Now, that makes for slightly complicated taxonomy, because you have these people who have desire-based theories, but then they also appeal to the self-interest theory. Well, often that's because they assume that what everybody would most want is their own well-being. So they take desire-based theories and it's just coinciding. When you get them to see that that's not true, then they have a choice. But no, I quite agree. It's a special case of a value-based view, if properly understood.
Well, in my comments, I specifically wanted, at least at one point, not to suggest that the only kind of thing that would give you a non-moral reason for something would be self-interest. I suggested that there might be people that we happen to care about.
Yeah,
and I
that's why
didn't
that's
necessarily mean that in a desire-based sense. I mean, I care about their well-being in a value-based.
Well, but the point is, I think you have reason to care about the fact that this stranger is going to lose his life. So for me, whether you could rationally consent depends on whether you have reason to care, not whether you do care. Now, I shouldn't put much weight on the phrase happen to care, but on this view, if people don't happen to care, then they can't rationally agree to it. And I'm saying, even if they don't care, they have reason to care, and that's why they could consent. So, now, probably you think you do have reason to care about the people you care about. But then I think, if you're accepting a value-based view of that kind, I don't think you should resist the sort of question I was asking quite as strongly as you did.
Well, I think along with several of the other questioners, what I wanted to say was that looks like a moral reason.
Well,
that's right.
Look, let me give you a good example of why I think it isn't a moral reason, and how, for all his greatness, I think there are ways in which Kant has had an unfortunate legacy. I discovered to my amazement recently that Sir David Ross, not a Kantian, but influenced by Kant, he thinks, he says, that if something is bad, you have a prima facie moral duty to prevent it if you can. But then he says, you don't have any moral duty to prevent your own pain and suffering. So he says, your own pain isn't bad. And then he says, oh, it is bad for other people, but it isn't bad for you. Okay? Now that's because he thinks that the content of the thought that it's bad has to be something about what morality tells you. Now, I don't think you have any moral obligation in those cases, but it's bad because it's something that you have reason to care about. And that's a good example of how, if one thinks that if you move out of a desire-based view, morality is going to do it all, you see what it leads to. It leads to Ross's view that your own pain isn't bad. Now, Kant himself says that it's not bad to be in pain. And so do those Kantians who say that states of affairs can't be bearers of value. On that account, it can't be bad to be in pain. If you have reason to prevent people's pain, it's because that expresses respect for the rational nature of the people who are in pain. But it's not because it's bad to be in pain. Well, I think it is. And I don't think that's a moral belief, as is shown by the fact that it's your own pain.
Well, I think we need to stop for today, but you're all invited to come back tomorrow at the same time for the second of Derek Parfit's Tanner lectures, which is titled Kant's Formula of Universal Law. And Susan Wolf will offer comments afterwards. Thank you very much.